Now, let's look at another reason for the freedom for the harm principle. This is the view that the freedom of inquiry, let's say 言论自由, basically the idea that I should be free to do what I want and to say what I want so long as I don't harm other people, is a necessary means for self-determination. Remember, the highest form of life is one where I lead the life in accordance with my own values. Let's look at John Stuart Mill's own words. He says, "He who lets his world, or his own portion of it, choose his own life plan for him, has no need of any other faculty than the ape-like one of imitation. He who chooses his plan for himself employs all his faculties. Only if I choose my own way of life, determine my own way of life, what major I take in university, what job I find, who I get married to, what religion I choose to adopt, only if I choose my own way of life am I exercising my distinctively human capacity for choice. And in order to exercise that faculty, I need to have freedom." It's a very simple view, but it's one that is hugely influential in Western societies. And sometimes, to be frank, there are obvious contrasts here. Just to give you one example, 我们上个礼拜跟一年级的学生有新生家长会。为什么有新生家长会呢？因为学生的父母对学生有很大的影响，对不对？我不知道你们为什么选政治学？谁觉得是因为我受到我的父母的影响？举手。没有什么好不好，我就想知道。没有吗？ Well, 可能你们 In my experience, the parents have a lot of influence on the choices here. Whereas in Western societies, I can assure you, there would not be a meeting with the parents of the university students because there's just an assumption that the parents have little influence over their children. Well, their adult children. They have little influence over what they choose to study in university, little influence over what work they choose, and little influence over who they marry. But in China, and in other choosing that have some liberal values, but maybe not as central as in most Western societies, the idea that parents have a legitimate role to play in helping us lead our lives, whether it means choosing a major in university, choosing a job, or choosing a marriage mate. The idea that parents have some role to play is quite central to societies like China, as we're going to see, that have a much more relational view of human happiness. There's a really important difference here between liberals and, let's call it, well, let's say Confucians, just to be a bit blunt. The liberal view is that happiness comes, let's say solely, or at least almost completely, from my decisions to lead my way of life as I see fit. That's why freedom is so central in liberal societies. because it's necessary for me to exercise my capacity of choice and of determining my own way of life. But if you have a view of the good life that is more relational, that is grounded in the idea that happiness comes from our human relations with families, with friends, then maybe freedom is not so central. This is something that we will discuss in the second half of the course, of the lecture. The Prime Minister. So, 这个 devil's advocate 这个词还是经常用. Okay, so the first argument for freedom is that it leads to truth, right? It's an important means to truth. The second argument is that it's an important means for self-determination, 自我决定. Obviously, if I want to plan and determine my own life, I should have control, as much control as possible over my life. Which means that I need freedom, right? So, for Mill, it's quite clear that if the best form of life is a freely chosen way of life, then I should have the freedom to choose my own way of life. Not everybody accepts that, right? Many of the valuable things in our life, I think, are not chosen. Did we choose to have our ties with parents? Did we choose to live in China? Well, in my case, I guess, but not in your case. Did we choose to love our country? Did we choose to love a particular religion? Sometimes these things are not chosen. We can argue about the importance of choice. Mill's real target, you have to ask, why was he saying these things? In his day, the dominant religion, of course, was Christianity. Well, it still is, but it was much more influential in those days. And it was an interpretation of Christianity that valued blind obedience to authorities, and that valued leading a kind of ascetic way of life, 禁欲主义, meaning that I should not pursue my happiness, I should not pursue my pleasures, I should listen to the religious authorities in a blind way. Mill was very critical of this form of life, obviously. For him, the good life lies in choosing your own way of life. Now, what's a third argument for freedom? Like Marx, here there is a convergence between liberals and Marxists. He believed in social progress. Of course, this is different than Confucians, right? Who tend to think the ideal society is a path society. But liberals and Marxists think that societies can and should progress. And for Mill, only societies that have freedom can make substantial progress. If everybody is a kind of conformist mass, let's say conformist, 就是盲目听别人的话, then you don't need freedom, right? If I just do things because my mother tells me to do things, or because my president tells me to do things, then I don't need freedom. I just follow. I'm like a machine, right? Or Mill would say like an ape, an animal. But if I place value upon choosing my own way of life, I'm going to sometimes be critical of the mainstream view. Let's say a little bit more about this. There's reasons for this. One is that, well, let's use freedom allows for a range of choice which will enable us to choose the wise and noble among us. This view was more common in the 19th century, not so common now in liberal societies. But of course, in Confucian influenced societies, it's more common. Let's put it this way. 有小人,有君子, right? 我们怎么知道谁是小人,谁是君子? Mill would say you need freedom to decide and to identify who are the wise and noble among us. Because sometimes the Junzi do not have power. And sometimes they lead different ways of life that the majority don't like. 有时候是可以说是非主流，有一点难听，但是君子有时候是一些是非主流的人，对不对？ So we need to have freedom to let those people who may be different and maybe potential or actual exemplary persons or junzi, we need freedom so that they could lead their own way of life. Especially in his own day, Mill thought that most people were 小人, let's put it this way. Most people were mediocre, and if you were just going to listen to the mainstream views, 主流的思想,主流的生活方式, it means you're basically listening to 小人, and you can't make progress by listening to this 小人, right? You need people who are different to show a potentially better way of life. Many of the great ideas, initially, when they were first proposed, sounded crazy, right? As I mentioned the case of Galileo, who argued that the Earth revolves around the sun. That was crazy when he first did it. People sometimes do experiments in their own way of life, and we should let them do it, so long as they don't physically harm people, because they can show something potentially better, right? What if this, this is maybe different than Western clothing, maybe a little bit strange, but maybe it's quite comfortable, which it is, and maybe it points to something different. Or, let me think of another example. 你们去过上海吗？上海有很多可爱的小狗，对不对？而且这些小狗冬天的时候都穿衣服。我第一次看，我觉得神经病，这些人为什么小狗要穿衣服呢？然后现在我发现穿衣服不一定不好，对不对？狗有时候会觉得冷，然后也更可爱。So usually these little experiments in living, initially we think it's a bit crazy, but we should allow people to do those things. And eventually those experiments in living will become the mainstream view, and the society can make progress. This is Mill's view. So he has some when we read it, it seems very strange. In English, the term eccentric, we can translate as 古怪的人. It sounds a little bit 有点变异中文, but in English, eccentric, especially in England, it's a little bit positive, actually, because 有点可爱, it's cute, and people are a little bit crazy, but sometimes those people are the real Junzi among us. And we should allow for those eccentric people, those 非主流的人, or those 古怪的人, we should allow them to lead their different way of life, to experiment, putting coats on cute dogs. Why not? And eventually, we might be grateful that they pointed to a better way of life. It allows society to make progress if people have the freedom to lead different, unusual, non-mainstream ways of life. Okay, this is Mill's view. So instead of discouraging, 你们是非主流的人，我们反对. We say, no, 可以鼓励他们，对不对? Maybe in the future they will be they will be recognized as the Zhunzi, the wise and noble among us, to use Mill's language. So he says this very strange thing. It seems strange on the face of it, but I think now we can understand it better. He says, the amount of eccentricity in a society has generally been proportional to the amount of genius, mental vigor, and moral courage which it contained. And now he says something very strong. He says that so few now dare to be eccentric is, or marks, the chief danger of our time. Now, 他觉得古怪的人少，是那个时代主要危险的标志. Why does he say that? Because if you have very few eccentrics in society, that means everybody is a conformist. 大家都盲目听别人的话，没有非主流的人，这个社会怎么可以进步呢？对不对？ That's his view. To make progress in society, you have to have different people who are different than the mainstream, maybe do something better, and allows us to move forward. That's his view. Of course, it's a very 19th century view. You know, after the 20th century, when we had bloody world wars with evil, dictators and so on, it seems strange to say that the lack of eccentrics is the chief danger, but that's his view. This is a little bit ugly, to be frank, but it's a passage about China, so I bring it up here. He says, you have to remember, in the West, there was a transition. In, let's say, around the 18th century, most thinkers were quite favorable to China, including the French philosopher Voltaire. They looked to China as an example of a more rational, well-organized, harmonious, bureaucratic society. But in the 19th century, almost all thinkers took a very negative view on China. Of course, it was influenced by the imperialism and colonialism which you had in the 19th century, and Mill was no exception to that. He says, we have a warning example in China, a nation of much talent and, in some respects, even wisdom. It's a little bit condescending, to be frank, but anyway, owing to the rare good fortune of having been provided at an early period with a particular good set of customs. Here he's a bit, he thinks that early parts of China were actually quite good. And he says the work in some measure of men, maybe like Kongzi, to whom even the most enlightened European must accord, under certain limitations, the title of sages and philosophers. It's a little bit condescending, but basically he's saying that early China did have sages and philosophers like Kongzi. And he says, surely the people who did this have discovered the secret of human progressiveness and must have kept themselves steadily at the head of the movement of the world. But now they have become stationary, 没有变化. And of course, this is bad history, but he says, they remained so for thousands of years. And here's the very ugly defense of imperialism. If they are ever to be improved, it must be by foreigners. 他说一定要依靠外国人才可以有进步. It's racist, imperialist, whatever, but that's his view. And so obviously, this part of Mill, we don't, hopefully we look at it now as just totally wrong-headed. But the basic point that you need freedom to have progress in society, arguably, is still valid, right? I mean, societies that have very little freedom What might be one example? 你们想一想，有没有一些国家或者有一些社会，他们没有什么自由，然后很难进步？
卢旺达是在卢旺达他们的国家建构导致的，他们目前为止依然是处在一个就是权威社会里，在这样权威社会里，由于所有人都依照本族的生活模式而进行生活，无法对对方的种族进行一种，就是说，对对方的种族以及私人的行为进行一种允许的这种宽恕，导致整个国家长期陷于内战当中，而最终无法发展。
OK， 但是现在Rwanda已经不错了。
然后如果你说非要说近现代，就是目前为止的话，可以举一个例子，就是苏丹的分裂。
OK， 苏丹分裂，可能也有在亚洲也有一些国家，我们不一定要讨论，可以想象啊。The thing let's look at some of the political implications of the harm principle. And here, many people think of liberals as advocating maximum amount of personal freedom and very little interference by the state, right? 如果你们想，比如说很多中国的自由主义者，他们会怎么想，对不对？个人自由很重要，然后国家不应该干涉，就是那么简单。但是，按照密尔的理论，不是那么简单。You have to take this harm principle seriously. Sometimes it leads to less interference by the state, but sometimes to more. Let's look at that a little bit. Because remember, it's not just sometimes actions that harm others. Sometimes it's inactions. 无为也可以伤害他人，对不对？ So this is very important. So for example, if I witness a murder, and then I'm called to go to court to show that I witnessed the murder and to make the criminal go to jail, I can be forced to go to court. Otherwise, the criminal will be free and more harm will come, right? So sometimes inactions can harm society, and the state can use force against people for this reason. Or sometimes protection of children. As mentioned earlier, if I do not give food to my child, the state can force me, 可以强迫我 to give food to my child, right? Let's look at some of these in a bit more detail. Mill was not arguing against the state's actions in all ways. In fact, he said in his own day, because there's no clear principle for when the state should interfere, his principle is clear, the harm principle. Because there was no clear principle, sometimes the state interfered too much and sometimes too little. Let's look at both of these in a bit more detail. Well, the most controversial part is that people should be free to buy what they want and to harm themselves. If I'm not harming other people, I should be free to do what I want, including not just smoking tobacco, not just drinking alcohol, but taking drugs like opium, 鸦片。他觉得我应该有吸鸦片的自由 because I'm harming myself, not harming other people, according to his theory. So, of course, you can argue that he was biased by his economic interests because he worked for the East Asia Company, which was involved with selling opium to China. And also, he had a very narrow view of harm, right? Maybe by taking opium, I'm not just harming myself, but I'm harming my family members, right? If I take opium, I harm my child because I don't pay attention to my child. He didn't think of all this stuff. But he was quite clear. This is a defense, basically, of the right to sell opium. He argued, why? Because it's an infringement on that of the buyer. I should have the freedom to buy opium because I'm only harming myself, and the state cannot restrict my actions for that reason. We can argue, as mentioned, maybe it's not just harming yourself, it's harming other people around you, but Mill had a very biased view, arguably because of his work with the East Asia Company. And now he says this. This is the very end, the last paragraph of On Liberty. He doesn't like a paternalistic state. 他反对家长制, paternalism. Because he thinks that if you have a benevolent dictatorship, 开明专制, people will stay like children. They have a good, benevolent leader. You just listen to the leader, and then you lead maybe okay life, never choosing your own way of life, and you're like a little child, and it becomes, you get used to that, and it becomes harder and harder to exercise the capacity for self-determination, which according to Mill is the main way of achieving true happiness. So he says here, this is the very end of On Liberty, or at least near the end. The worth of a state in the long run is the worth of individuals composing it. And a state which postpones the interests of their mental expansion and elevation. Actually, you have something very similar in Confucianism, right? Kong Zi 说, 富是很重要, 对不对? 但是先富后教, 对不对? You have to morally educate the people. This is very similar to Mill's idea. And the state should not postpone their mental expansion and elevation. And if it does that, if a state dwarfs its men so that they become docile instruments in the hands, even if it's for good purpose instruments, this kind of state will find that with small men, 小人, we can literally translate it as 小人, no great thing can really be accomplished. And the perfection of the machinery of the state, to which it has sacrificed everything, will in the end lead to nothing. For want of that vital power, which, in order that the machine, meaning the state, might work more smoothly, it has prepared to banish. The vital power is its capacity for choice, capacity for self-determination. In Mill's view, and this is a very standard liberal view still today, the main obligation of the state is to provide the conditions that allow us to lead freely chosen ways of life. And if you have a state that does everything for us, I don't need to choose my own way of life. I'll be like a happy animal, but not a truly happy human. In Mill's view, a truly happy human freely chooses their own way of life. Now people criticize liberalism for saying that it encourages selfishness, 是不是偏自私自利？不一定, not necessarily. The point here is not that I should be selfish. I should care for others, but the state cannot force me to care for others. 国家不能强迫，不应该强迫。There's one exception though, and this is the idea of a clear and present danger. Mill gives the example. If I'm about to cross a bridge, 过桥, and then and then you know that the bridge is dangerous and about to collapse, then you could stop me from crossing the bridge. It's a very clear and present danger. But if the danger is a little bit vague or long-term or unclear, then the state cannot interfere with my actions. And this had huge influence later. 100 years after Mill wrote his book, you had debates in the 1960s about whether the state should make homosexuality illegal, 同性恋. Before the 1960s, in England and most Western societies, homosexuality was illegal because it was viewed as bad. Mill's view is that the view, when this debate became hugely important in the 1960s, thinkers appealed to John Stuart Mill's ideas of harm. If two homosexuals love each other and they don't harm each other, even if we think it's bad or immoral, they should be free to do that. The state cannot interfere. Actually, the Prime Minister of Canada now, his name is Justin Trudeau. His father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, was the Prime Minister of Canada. 70年代、70年代是加拿大的总理. He had a very famous saying too, very similar to Mill's idea. The state cannot interfere with what people do in their bedrooms, so long as they don't physically harm each other. It's up to them. Maybe some people think it's bad. That's fine. The state cannot interfere because there's no physical harm being committed. Certainly, there's no clear and present danger. Eventually, this argument, directly inspired by Mill, won, and homosexuality was declared legal, first in the UK and then in most Western societies. Of course, China never had such rigid views against homosexuality, at least before the 20th century, so maybe it wasn't such a big 20th century. But in some areas, the state needs to interfere more than it does, not less. 国家应该干涉，比如说 the rights of children, right? 儿童权利. In his day, children had very little rights. If you were 8 years old, you could be forced to work in a factory. Mill was against that. He said children should have education so that they develop their capacity for self-determination. There should be compulsory education for all children, which was not true in his day. So he was arguing for more interference, not less. More rights of women. Women in his day did not have the rights to, basically, did not have equal rights. Not equal rights to divorce, not equal rights to own property, not equal rights to find jobs. He argued that the state should interfere, should change those laws to give equal rights to women so that they, like men, can exercise their capacity for choice. He had more controversial things to say about regulation of population, but let's leave that aside.